sitting here at this end, Michael Kelleher, American poet. His most recent book is Visible Instruments. The one before that is called Museum Hours. The poem he's going to be reading for us today is from Visible Instruments. In addition to being a poet, as I think some of you know, he's also the director of the Wyndham Campbell Prizes based out of Yale University. We're very glad that he and 2 Wyndham Campbell Prize winners are here at the festival this year. It's Mike's second time at Bocas, so obviously we were funny enough for him to want to come back. So we're glad he's here. And next to him, Adalber Salas Hernández, Venezuelan poet. Venezuela is about 15 miles off that way, not so far away. If we went to the top floor of the library and looked out to the west, you could see Venezuela, but somehow he's never been to Trinidad before, even though we're very close neighbors. He has published actually many books of poems and many translations because he also works as a translator. And on Sunday morning, he's going to be on our translation panel talking about that specifically. He writes in Spanish, as you might expect, but you will understand him because he's fully fluent in English. And he's going to be reading some poems for us today in both Spanish and English. You'll hear the English version and the Spanish version, which will be interesting. And because he writes in Spanish, and all of his published books so far are in Spanish, there is actually a translator who's been working with him to do an English translation, which is forthcoming. But in the interim, specially for Bocas, very limited edition of 48 copies. We've got a little chapbook with 6 of his poems in it. It is actually available at the booksellers. So I didn't want to have an author at the festival without a book, so there's a book. So that's Mike, that's Adalber. Give them a big round of applause to welcome them. We'll hear some poems and then we'll talk.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thanks everybody for coming out. It's really great to be up here with Nicholas because Nicholas and I, in addition to sharing the fact that we're both poets, we're also both arts administrators for a living, and there aren't too many of these creatures on the planet, so it's really nice to have a moment to sit and chat. So I was trying to decide which poem to read out of this book. It's primarily made up of longish poems, and so I have one poem about God and one poem about dog, which God and dog are, God is dog spelled backwards, etc. So I've decided to go with God. This is a poem I wrote a few years back now, and it's a long poem. It's the only poem I'm going to read. It'll take me about 8 minutes. It's all one sentence that lasts 4 pages and pages and pages. Just briefly, I ran into an old professor of mine from graduate school who was a philosopher, and I told him how much I admired his sort of close reading techniques, where we would spend 6 weeks reading 3 paragraphs of Hegel, and how I kind of missed that sort of close reading. And he said, someday I'd like to do a whole semester on one word. And I was like, wow, what word? And he's like, God. The God poem for Rudolf Gachet. That there might in fact be but one idea in the whole history of human thought worthy of attention, and that one idea can be expressed in a word, and that word alone, that idea, is the only one, despite or even because of its being a fabrication, an untruth, a lie, both logically and scientifically indefensible, making it something akin to, yet in duration, reach, and depth exceeding the highest of the so-called human attainments, that is to say, art, to which we knowingly and willingly devote so much of our attention, not to mention our money and time and intellectual and spiritual energy, but which pales in the face of the concept of God, a being or force or energy that transcends all time and space, giving birth ad infinitum to the new, able to move forward or backwards in time, for instance, to the sudden explosion that brought into being the universe, before even that, to whatever was there to explode, and to wherever there actually was. And if there was more than one there, that is, more than one universe expanding, an infinity of universes burning up and out, whose infinite deaths leave infinite trails of past life in the form of particles and or waves of light that dance about the heavens, refracted and reflected off an infinite number of floating, spinning, flying, careening things like moons and stars, like asteroids and planets, some of which, like planet Earth, have awakened to these phenomena and have chosen to receive and collect, to analyze and interpret their various meanings, have chosen to give these bountiful yet seemingly insignificant waves and or particles of light a meaning, i.e. God, or the idea of God, which idea might be explained as human failure to comprehend the meaning of light and its attendant manifestations, which so often go unnoticed in the daily thrum of living, requiring us all to eat and sleep and drink and seek out the things that will sate these needs, leaving little if any time at all, even among the diligent hordes of interpreters holding the various interpretive positions within the infinite number of disciplines invented to aid the human race in its quest to discover within the profusion of data received on any given day a unified field of understanding, one so comprehensive, so complete, as to explain the whole universe of phenomena by means of a single equation, which function was preceded by the use from time immemorial of a single word, God, the subject of this poem, possibly the single most beautiful false idea, and for so being, the most worthy of our attention. And so the poem continues, and the idea of God endures in all its fruitfulness, as inspiration, guiding light, organizing principle, ideal, catch-all explanation, mysterious source of human power, moral bludgeon, ethical center, justification for war and all imaginable kinds of craven human behavior, basis for ideologies of every stripe, every one of whose precedence lies in either the belief that God stands atop a ladder and that human hierarchies are but natural imitations of same, or that we're all born equal in God's eyes and therefore justice or property or what have you must be equally parceled out. And where would any of these ideas have been without the idea of a God who both loves and punishes all in equal measure, be it now or in the hereafter, another beautiful idea in which every human consciousness lives on, intact and aware of itself, long past the death of the physical body, this hereafter often being called heaven, that place beyond death to which humans aspire. And wouldn't that be nice to know that after death there's another life, a better life than this, in which necessity is finally forgot, where no one wants and no one lacks and all are one and the same, and how this idea is nearly as lasting as the idea of God, if not quite so, how the idea of God endures despite all subsequent contradicting facts, despite the patent absurdity of believing in an entity beyond all time and space, not only eternally fruitful, not just the end and beginning and middle and purpose of all living things, but also sensitive to every being and object, every energy, every movement, every force and counterforce, every change in weather or plans or disposition, responsive to each and every being across the broad expanse of its creation. The absurdity of that, of all belief, and yet the utterly compelling beauty it has inspired, the millennia of paintings, sculptures, poems, and musical compositions, the rituals, rites, and dramas, the comedies and tragedies, the sitcoms and miniseries, the video games and epic films, not to mention the great books devoted solely to telling the story of God's eternal dance with human beings. How these books have at times inspired fanatical concentration on the meaning of the words that were written therein, as if they were transcriptions of the word of God himself, or herself, or itself. And so they came to believe that they could divine from these organized collections of signs, not just a meaning eternal and fixed and true, but an intention that is the intention of God. Not only what God wants the words to mean, but what God wants those who read the words to do, how God wants them to behave, to reign in their desires, and by so doing achieve a kind of triumph over time and space, wherein consciousness will live on happy and free in the aforementioned afterlife. And how these same books inspired other schools of interpretation that believe the words on the page could not have been written by God because the words themselves are imperfect, riddled as they are with ambiguity and error, how they refuse time and again to stand still, bearing within each one such a wide multiplicity of meanings. It would take a literal eternity to interpret them all, not to mention the difficulty in trying to find within that multiplicity a single unified and stable intention, fixed and eternal, from which might be deduced a rigid and transparent code of conduct applicable to all people at all times, in all places, regardless of historical context. And still there are others who believe the infinite plasticity of meaning is itself a true reflection of the fecundity and multiplicity of God, and so worship him or her or they or it as a principle rather than a deity per se. In short, everything is everything. For were it even a desirable end, then unity of intent would be in fact the case, which so clearly it is not. And why? Why would a perfect being, perfect in every way, including its infinite multiplicitousness, create a world reflecting neither its form nor its intent? The short answer being it would not. Therefore, God's infinite perfection consists of the infinite multiplicity of her or his or its creations, a concept not to be confused with another school of thought that argues, yes, the universe is multiple and infinite, meaning contextual and relative and historically specific. However, God is an irreducible unity, and the multiplicity of creation is in fact a form of retribution meted out to punish human beings for their transgressions, namely the desire to know the world as God, that is, to know the world in all its multiplicity, for which sin they must suffer the pangs of birth and the fear of death. And they have written stories about how God has punished and punished and punished human beings, at times to set examples, at other times to test the faithful's faithfulness. And in one strand of thought, the story goes that God will one day send to earth a Savior to rescue human beings from themselves, and he will arrive with fire in his eyes and love in his heart to punish the wicked and carry the faithful to heaven. And one day a man of great charisma comes along who holds sway in the hearts and minds of many, encouraging them to sacrifice their social status, family lives, material possessions in order to follow him, and many do, and they become annoying and preachy and eventually provoke the ire of the authorities who put the man to death. And it is written, he rose from the grave and came to speak to his disciples, which fact led them to believe that it was he that God had sent, which declaration split this school into two schools, old and new. The old believing that the messenger sent by God had yet to appear, the new believing he already had and shall return again to punish the wicked and carry the faithful to heaven. How this schism will alter human history. Sorry, I lost my place. And I'll take a breath, thank you. When the largest and most powerful empire the world has ever known will consecrate the new as official state religion and will rule the world for centuries hence, inspiring the construction of thousands of magnificent places of worship, the majority built of stone, vast and mostly empty spaces, indirectly lit by rays of sun refracted through panes made of colored glass, illustrations of stories told in the Holy Book, literally illumining them for the faithful Mass. And these vast and mostly empty spaces would be owned and operated by a worldwide community of celibate men who would throughout their history align their interests with the powerful, a long-lasting, mutually beneficial arrangement. But we're getting a bit off topic. Our topic being, you might recall that there is but one idea in history worthy of attention, and that idea can be summed up in a single word: God, all-seeing, all-knowing, all-feeling, infinitely creative, loving and just in equal measure, rendering logical contradictions moot. How the history of ideas is itself but a history of this one idea, the proverbial elephant in the room. The elephant, with its great gray bulk and prodigious powers of memory, being often a symbol of God, lurking at the margins of the argument, neither taking part nor taking sides, unsuspected, insistent, and unseen. Thanks.
Hello, yeah, it's working. Okay, I can't hear myself, so I guess it's a good thing. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Nicholas, for inviting me and for this absolutely beautiful object. I have my copies, and I am reluctant to give them to anyone because they're so beautiful, really, that I am afraid that if I give them away, eventually, if one gets damaged, I won't have anything to replace it with. So since you read about God, I would start with one of the poems here that is called St. John Coltrane in the Infernos. I'm going to be reading both in English and Spanish. He'd rather play here, even though it has horrible acoustics and you can barely make out the rough breathing of the saxophone. He'd rather climb on stage despite the damage to the microphone, the bad ventilation, the drinks with no ice. Right here, just 15 minutes from eternity, maybe less, with the junkies and old-night whores among the condemned for being amphibious and ambidextrous, for being asymmetrical, right here, so far from celestial choruses, with only space for ascent, because this music can only rise. It was made from things that collapse without a sound and with no apologies. It doesn't separate the meat of the day from the bones of the night. It doesn't sit at the right hand of anyone. A hard rain, tin can wind, inconclusive and stubborn sky, music with a wound on its flank that doesn't bleed, light seeking dust on your hands. Let's see, where might it be now? Okay, can't find it, sorry. Which number is it? 23. Yeah, I'm way off map. Okay, finally. Sorry about the suspense. San John Coltrane en los infiernos. Prefiere tocar aquí, aunque haya pésima acústica y apenas se escuche la respiración rugosa del saxofón. Prefiere montarse en escena a pesar del micrófono dañado, la mala ventilación, los tragos sin hielo. Aquí, a tan solo 15 minutos de la eternidad, si no menos, entre los yonkis y las putas trasnochadas, entre los condenados por anfibios o ambidiestros, por faltos de simetría, aquí, bien lejos de los coros celestiales, donde ya no queda espacio para un ascenso más. Porque esta música solamente puede subir. Fue hecha con esas cosas que se derrumban sin un crujido, sin pedir perdón. No separa la carne del día de los huesos de la noche, no se sienta a la diestra de nadie. Lluvia dura, viento de hojalata, cielo inconcluso y terco, música que lleva en el costado una herida que no sangra, luz que busca hacerse polvo entre las manos. The next one, as some of you probably know, Simón Bolívar, who was Venezuelan, and it's a figure, it's a historical figure that one can seldom escape. And he lived for a time in Jamaica, so, and from there he wrote one of his better known documents, so to speak. And it has been known historically just as Letter from Jamaica. So this poem shares that title, but it goes in a very different way. I, Simón José Antonio de la Santísima Trinidad, Bolívar y Ponte, Palacios y Blanco. I, King of Thieves. My dear sir, I address your majesty from the cursed circumstance of water everywhere, from the tenuous heart of life they call exile. I do so, for I wish to speak with you regarding that pile of ashes and sand that gave birth to me, that land intoxicated by so much sun, dazzled by its hunger for history. I know it well. I have traveled widely in my time, but never have I truly crossed the borders of Venezuela. Each word I pronounce ties my feet to it, cuts through my mouth with an amniotic taste. That's why I know, observing it from these strange shores, I have failed trying to liberate it. I must confess to your majesty, I have sowed the sea, I have planted in the wind. I have failed, I swear by the God of my parents. It has cost me so much to understand that my country is a geographical error, a banal promise, a paradise invented by the deaf, a mass of cords and tendons, a jumble of flesh and wood, the cradle of debris, of plagiarism, a strip of dust fascinated by the movements of the sea, the animal that can't stand still because it will die of thirst. Your Majesty can glance at the map, an arbitrary cumulus of restless lines and veins, of badly sewn patches. Truly I say to you, an eye will pass through the camel's needle before my land goes through the doors of heaven. Pays, 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 pays. No spelling can sustain my country. It's not a homeland, it's a wager we have lost. As you can see, I do not lie. I'm an honest man from where the palm tree grows. I come from a region whose nature opposes everything, whose God is a glorified gravedigger. I don't want to see my face carved in its coins, in those flaccid metals that buy nothing, that weigh down pockets like a clumsy organ. I don't want my name in the mouth of its soldiers, on its shield, in the childlike cadence of its anthem. I don't want my memory stained by all the nervous gestures it will make to convince itself it is a nation. I will climb into the sepulchre. Far from there, a tree will grow from my chest, filling my lungs with gunpowder and roots. I refuse to keep fighting for the land whose only merit has been to leave my hands dirty from childhood. Carta de Jamaica. Yo, Simón José Antonio de la Santísima Trinidad, Bolívar y Ponte, Palacios y Blanco. Yo, rey de Tebas, muy señor mío, me dirijo a vuesa merced desde la maldita circunstancia del agua por todas partes, desde la médula tenue de la vida que llaman exilio. Lo hago porque preciso hablarle sobre ese montículo de arena y ceniza que me vio nacer, esa tierra ebria de tanto sol, encandilada por su hambre de historia. La conozco bien, mucho he viajado en mis días, pero nunca realmente he atravesado las fronteras de Venezuela. Cada palabra que pronuncio ata mis pies a ella, atraviesa mi boca con un sabor amniótico. Por ello sé, al observarla desde estas costas extrañas, que he fracasado al intentar liberarla. Eso debo confesar a vuesa merced. He arado en el mar, sembrado en el viento. He fallado, lo juro por el Dios de mis padres. Mucho me ha costado entender que mi país es un error de la geografía, una promesa banal, un paraíso inventado por sordos, un amasijo de cuerdas y tendones, un revoltijo de carne con madera, la cuna de los ripios, de los plagios, una franja de polvo fascinada con los movimientos del mar, ese animal que no sirve, que no puede quedarse inmóvil porque muere de sed. Sírvase vuesa merced de mirar su mapa, un cúmulo arbitrario de líneas y venas inquietas, de parches mal cosidos. En verdad le digo, primero pasará un ojo por la aguja de un camello que mi tierra por las puertas de los cielos. País, pi, país, pi. Ninguna ortografía sabe sostenerlo. No es una patria, es una apuesta que perdimos. Como ve, no miento. Soy un hombre sincero, de donde crece la palma. Vengo de una región cuya naturaleza se opone a todo, cuyo Dios es un sepulturero glorificado. No quiero ver mi rostro grabado en sus monedas, en esos metales flácidos que nada compran, que cargan los bolsillos como un órgano torpe. No quiero mi nombre en la boca de sus soldados, en su escudo, en la cadencia pueril de su himno. No quiero que mi memoria sea manchada por todos los ademanes nerviosos que harán para convencerse de que es una nación. Bajaré al sepulcro lejos de allí. Me crecerá un árbol en el pecho, me llenará los pulmones de raíces y de pólvora. No seguiré luchando por esa tierra que solo ha servido para dejarme las manos sucias de infancia. And I don't know if we have time for one more or yeah? A short one. I don't have any short ones anymore. So well, let's leave it at that. Yeah.
So that just means that you're going to have to buy the chapbook to read some more of the poems.
Yeah.
Maybe if I run out of interesting things to ask you, you can read another very long poem at the end. We'll see. Maybe I'll run dry in just a few seconds. So thank you very much to both of you. Okay, so I want to start. I'm sorry, you just walked into a trap. I want to start by asking you a very short question that's not at all easy to answer. But why don't we start big? And it's because it's a question I like to ask all poets because I'm genuinely curious about the answer, which it's very simple. Of all the things that you could be writing, why do you write poems? Mike. Why poetry?
Well, I guess with any writer, when you start at a certain age, I mean, I guess some writers just start writing and they figure out what they want to write right away. But I think most people play around in all sorts of different forms when they're younger, and I've certainly tried my hand at short stories and plays and other forms. And so on the one hand, it's the only one that I've ever felt competent at of the literary forms that I've tried my hand at. But I also, I think I enjoy the sort of interplay between the sort of improvisation of writing and then the sort of other improvisation of reading that goes along with poetry. I mean, I think the oral side of poetry is a significant part of it. So I think I've always enjoyed both, sitting down and composing in silence or reading to myself, but also then, trying to sort of interpret that for an audience. How's that?
Yeah, good, plausible. What about you? Why poems? You're also an essayist and a translator, but what is it about poetry?
Well, and I mainly translate poetry, or I try to, as far as the editors let me. But so I think poetry is the register that I find more attractive because of the way that it condensates meaning, and then it throws it in 1,000 different directions at once. And for me, that's really fun to write, because it feels for me like a game, whereas when I write essays, I do have to be responsible for what I'm saying in a very specific way. Similarly, I started writing trying different registers. I tried narrative and so on, but I noticed that my short stories tended to read more like prose poems. So I absolutely gave up on the idea of narrating coherently and just went for the images.
Who wants to narrate coherently? There's probably a novelist in the audience who wants to stone me now. Mike, it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong and you'll tell me, but one of the themes that runs through Visible Instruments, at least that I discern, is it's the unpredictability and the randomness and maybe even the unlikeliness of the things that instigate writing, of the events, the observations, the whatever. That many of the poems actually start by saying something like basically kind of admitting this is the thing that has triggered this poem. And I wonder if that's something that especially fascinates you, the question of where poems or where writing comes from.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, to go back to what I was saying in the previous question, was that there is, what I like about poetry is that it always feels like a kind of improvisation to me, and whether that's, the writing being improvisatory or the thought processes being improvisatory. I'm always interested in the way that things come into the poem as I'm writing it. When I was writing this particular book, which is quite a long time ago now, it sat at a publisher for a lot longer than I should admit, having not gotten really angry about. And it just came out this past year. But at the time, I was writing a blog, and it was a blog called Aimless Reading. And what I would do is each day I would take a book off my shelf, and take a photograph of it next to my face, and then I would write about the book in my blog, and I would try and remember where I got the book, and it became this kind of ongoing memoir. So at that time, all of my writing was happening while looking at a screen. Like, I wasn't writing these as I do more often now, by hand first, and then writing them on the computer. And so when you're writing, I think, on the screen, it's really easy to kind of just drift off into the internet. And I often found that when I was writing away, this particular book of poems is, a lot of the poems are quite long, and so I was trying to figure out a way to, instead of doing the condensation, which I had done quite a bit. My first couple of books are very tight and compact with short lines and short poems, and these are all longer with longer lines, and there's a little bit more of sort of luxuriating in the thought process. But it also required this figuring out how to think in a longer form, right? Instead of, Pound says like whatever poetry is condensation, what if poetry is, expansion? And so how do you just keep adding and adding and adding? And so the internet is a really great place to do that, because you can start thinking about something and then you can just sort of like hyperlink your mind into another web page, and you can go to a definition of a word, or you can start reading some text and just sort of appropriate that text into the poem. And so I guess I was kind of fascinated with that. And there was, what ended up, as I went through the process of writing this book, it started to become very sort of meta, where I was sort of constantly remarking on the fact that I was writing these poems as I was writing them.
And in Museum Hours, which is the book which, if I've got the sequence correctly, you wrote after this one was published before.
Correct.
Quite a lot of the poems in there, they start with a work of visual art. So I'm not sure if you would necessarily call them ekphrastic poems, but there's a conversation in there with artists and with the visual, and you reference lots of artists: Marc Chagall, Louise Bourgeois, Paul Klee. I don't even remember who else. So I'm curious about what drew you to that kind of writing in particular, and whether this was a new thing, a sort of a different new phase you entered in your writing, where the visual became a kind of a provocation.
I think it really had a lot to do with just several coincidences that occurred in the composition of these poems. So that book grew out of the end of the blog. I reached the end of my library, which I had organized in alphabetical order, and I got to Z, and I didn't want to start the blog over. And so my final blog post was sort of lamenting about what I was going to do next. And a friend of mine who is an artist, a visual artist who I've known for a long time, wrote to me and said, and she's French, and she wrote to me and she said, you remember all of those little 3x5 cards that I used to type up in my studio that you thought were like poems? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, why don't, do you think you'd like to translate some of those? And I said, well, I don't speak French, so I'm not sure that would be the ideal thing for me to do, but maybe I could do something with them. And so I started off, and that's I started off by taking these. She would type up just little things that she was thinking about on 3x5 cards on like old typewriters that she had laying around her studio, and she probably writes more than any writer I've ever met. She has like file cabinets full of these 3x5 cards, and so I started taking them and just typing the text into Google Translate and seeing what came out the other end, and then kind of working up these short little poems off of those. So that was like the first thing I started doing that with her. At the same time, there was this poet. I guess this book is very bound up in the internet as well. There was this poet or novelist from, I think he's Russian, and he lives up in Canada, and he was every day sort of posting paintings in his Facebook feed that I started admiring, and then one day I just kind of wrote a poem off of one, and then I wrote a poem off of another, and so that led to another section of the book. And then I guess the thing that brought it all together was I read this book of ekphrastic poems called Study by this Japanese poet named Yuka Otomo, and I really admired it because she's really primarily a visual artist, not a poet, and there's something just really compellingly sort of forthright and transparent and beautiful about her poems that that they didn't feel like they were written by a poet, and yet they retained all the sort of qualities that I like about poems. And so all of these things just started happening at the same time separately, and then there was just that moment where it all came together, that I had a book in my hands. So.
Okay. Adalber. You did an interview for, I think, a Venezuelan newspaper a couple of months ago, which I read in Spanish with the help of Google Translate. And you said lots of interesting things in it, but one phrase kind of stuck out. Somewhere you said, "My voice is migrating."
I said what? Sorry.
My voice is migrating.
Oh yeah.
And what I think I didn't remember to say in my introduction was that this is a Venezuelan poet who currently lives in New York. You've lived in New York for a few years now. It's currently based at NYU. So I think, there was, in a sense, you were literally talking about the fact that you were now writing from a place that was not your place of birth. But I'm interested in that idea of your voice migrating because, of course, there are many, many, many Caribbean writers, many of them in the room here, who don't live in the Caribbean anymore. And that idea of where the voice, began and where it ends and who's listening is a really key thing. And then in the same interview, you also go on to talk about your attempt to open channels of communication between poetry and translation and scholarship, and that's a kind of a migration as well. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that, and also just tell us if you think your voice as a poet is changing in response to this new place, to New York.
Okay, so short answer is yes, absolutely. See, the thing is that I must confess I find boring. I find those poets who tend to write always obsessively this kind of the same poem over and over again throughout their books. I find them deeply boring. So what I try to do, so as to not bore myself to death, is to change the register from one book to the other. And in that sense, migration sort of has been handy, so to speak. It forced me actually to find new registers, to sort of to be able to express that new experience, living not only in a city highly different from Caracas, but also to find myself in a situation that makes my return to Venezuela highly unlikely. So translation came naturally at that point. I had started translating about a year before I left. However, it became this sort of drug for me. It has become the past years a sort of drug. I hardly can spend a day without translating or thinking about translation or talking about translation. And in the process, learning new languages, I learned them really with only the purpose of translating some more.
So you're not interested in talking to live people, you just want to translate. Okay, now you know, audience.
And there are several people in the audience exactly that I want to translate, even though they might not know it just yet, but they will. So the whole thing just came together for me in a beautiful way. Migration writing and poetry writing specifically and translation. And I began experimenting with the long deceased authors who were kind enough to be dead for a few hundred years and wouldn't be mad if I took their poems and twisted them and gave them unexpected turns. And
Can I ask you a follow-up to that? Can you talk a little bit about what, so you've been reading your poems in Spanish and in English aloud to an audience, and how does that register in your consciousness as your voice versus the voice of the translator when you're reading?
I'm impersonating someone else, definitely. But the weird thing is that when I read out loud in front of an audience, I have this keen sense of faking my own life, in a way. So when I read a translation, it kind of, it is complete. The whole theater just, it is complete. Yeah.
I want to, there may be some questions in the audience. There's one more thing I want to ask you, which is about, as I said, Venezuela is just 15 or 20 miles off that way. And I don't want to sort of set you up as, some kind of representative of Venezuelan literature to speak on behalf of an entire national literature, but I'm curious to know. The fact is that for most of us here in Trinidad and Tobago, and I would suspect in the rest of the Caribbean, and largely because of the language barrier, we have no idea of what's going on in contemporary writing in Venezuela. And I wonder if it's the same. I mean, you obviously, because of your current research and translation, you are paying very close attention to what's being written in English and French and Haitian Creole in the Caribbean, but for the most part, is the Venezuelan literary scene aware of what's going on here? Because we don't know what's going on there.
No, they're not. No, no, but believe me, they have no idea. Venezuela kind of tried to set itself up as a continental country, and the Caribbean was just there for fun, or as an other to set apart and differentiate itself from. And so the
Andean destiny thing.
Kind of,
yeah.
yes, yeah. No, the situation is not as dire as in Colombia, where it's kind of, breathtaking the way they want to differentiate themselves from the Caribbean. But still, so Venezuela sort of built this narrative in which they were a great continental nation. And I think with a bit of luck, the current dire situation will make the country reconsider that.
Anyone in the audience wants to ask a question? There we go. So the mic is coming from the back of the
Or a
room.
complaint also.
Or
I take complaints.
Complaints, a disagreement. Oh, wait, sorry. Is it switched on? Switch on the bottom of the mic. Switch on the bottom. Yeah. There we go. Oh, all right. Okay.
I'm curious as to if you have a language that you prefer to translate into Spanish, or if there is a language that you find easy to go from Spanish to.
Well, it's okay. So I have a two-headed answer. So the first head would be, or the first tongue would be English, because it's the first one I learned it's my second language. However, when I am translating an author whose work has been written in either French, Portuguese, or Haitian Creole, or when I come out of Haitian Creole class, that's my favorite language at the moment. The one that, or more than favored language. I tend to think in that other language for a while. So it becomes almost comfortable to go from Spanish to that language and back and forth.
Janet. Oh.
Why?
Oh.
Oh, because I'm immersed in it. Say, I'm translating from French, and every day for 3 to 4 hours, I'm there, trying to figure out a way to come from French to Spanish. But when I leave the translation, it works the other way around, and I find myself thinking phrases in French or, say, Portuguese or Creole, and it becomes almost a game I play with myself. And I am aware this sounds really weird, I'm sorry, but it becomes this sort of internal dialogue between languages.
Okay, yes, and then Janet has a question in front after.
Okay, I have a question for you, Mike. Mike, I noticed in the piece that you read a discursive quality, and yet you were working with the rubric, with a particular theme. And so I was wondering about the tension between, the meandering, and then when you had to pull it back to deal with God.
Well, it was interesting. As I was saying, that book was a little bit of an experiment for me in the sense of, like, I had to sort of change the way that I thought about writing from, starting with this mass and condensing it down to its essence, and sort of doing the opposite and sort of expanding it outward. And so as I started to do that, I think it allowed my thought to just become more discursive, and as I got into this kind of flow, it would move along. But the other thing that was a challenge for me was, when you start writing in these longer lines, when you're writing in these short, like 3, 4, 5 syllable lines, and then you're cutting them off, it's really easy to improvise a rhythm as you're going through, I think. but it's not so when you have to go out a little bit further in the lines. And so I've never written kind of like metrical verse before, but I started just playing around with iambic pentameter and not really writing very strictly in it at all, but kind of using it as almost like a baseline, and that was this way of sort of maintaining a kind of musicality to the language, and that, it just sort of kept it in check, as you sort of move from one side to the next, and it became a kind of, container for the thoughts. But as far as returning to a moment, I think that was really just a sort of instinctive thing. There was this moment where you've gone so far off, and you're like, where am I again? I mean, it happened while I was reading. Like I lost my, that's how the thinking goes too. You just sort of get, and as I was saying before, I became kind of aware and started just sort of commenting on that throughout the poems in that book, where that became a way of sort of just checking myself and just saying out loud, I don't know where the hell I am right now, so I'll just say that, and then we'll kind of move on to the next thing and try and get back to the beginning.
So, Mike, were you brought up Catholic?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, we all got that from listening to the poem, right? Okay. Got a question from Janet here.
My question actually follows on very much, Nicholas, from what you just asked Mike there. I was struck by both of you reading poems that clearly had touchstones in Christianity. And Richard Wagner always declared that art was the ultimate divine because it's ultimately transformational. What do you think of that? He said that art should be the most perfect of religions. What's your position on that theory?
Adalber.
I love appropriating religious imagery, especially Catholic, because I was brought up Catholic as well. But I was a 13-year-old apostate. Yes, apostate. That's the apostate, not apostle. However, Catholicism kind of wore off pretty quickly. But I do love using that imagery with irony. So, and I mistrust all transformations and all conversions. Either because I find them oddly, how should I put it, way too convincing to be true, or maybe an excuse for something else. I know I'm being I might be being unfair. But yeah, for me, religion is a way to mess with the reader, mostly.
Is translation not a form of transformation?
Yes, and it is also a scam, by the way.
Is translation a form of transubstantiation?
I know, not for me. I wouldn't go that far.
We'll leave the theology for another session. Mike?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, on some level, right? I mean, there's, when you grow up in a very religious family, as I did, and then you have a sort of break from that, it's, it is traumatic. And I remember once having a conversation with the poet Clayton Eshelman, and he was asking me, we were sitting across the table at a dinner, and he was sort of asking me these really penetrating questions throughout the course of the dinner. One of which was, like, were you raised Catholic? And tell me about that. And I said, it's something that I'm trying to sort of push aside and get rid of. And he was like, no, that's going to be the source of your poetry. And in some ways, he's right. Because it is this thing that because it's my earliest experience, and it's because it is the sort of structuring experience of my childhood that. It's something that I can't let go of, and that I keep returning to in the work, despite whatever sort of intellectual misgivings I have about it. And maybe you can find it in art.
Yeah, failed Catholic poets are the most Catholic poets of all. So everyone, I'm looking at my watch. We have another session. Okay, all right, just because it's you, Kelly, you can ask a question, and that will be the last one. Just because it's Kelly.
No pressure.
I think you turned it
It's
on.
on,
Okay.
yeah.
It's a really quick question. Nicholas, I'm taking you at your word that we're eavesdropping on a conversation, and the question that you began with, I would like you to answer.
Oh, what was the question I began with? Let me look.
Why poetry?
Why poetry? Because I have actually thought about this, so I can answer it pretty succinctly.
That's cheating, you know.
No. I mean, I write because I read. Because if the hierarchy of things. I was a very bookish child. I started reading pretty young. I've always loved books, and the only reason I write is because I was immersed in books from very young. And poems are the only kind of writing that made me want to write. I mean, I've never read a novel and thought, wow, I'd like to do that. I've never been to a play and thought, wow. Well, sometimes I go to a play and think, wow, I'd love to be an actor, but I've never wanted to write a play. But I very, very often read poems and think, yeah, that's what I want to do. So it's the kind of writing that motivates me. Also, I'm also easily bored. I'm very impatient, and I don't know how people sit down and spend 5 years writing a novel. I'm sorry, I'd be bored after 3 months. I don't know. I can barely read most novels. Least of all, sit down and write one. So that's the answer. And on that note, having let everything out and opened myself up to even more hatred from all the novelists in the audience, please let's give the two poets a round of applause. Their books are available for sale from the booksellers. I'm going to make sure they go and sit out at the book signing table if you want to get your book signed or if you want to chat with them. Mike is going to be back on stage on Sunday. He's going to be talking to Andre Alexis. And Adalber is going to be back on Sunday as well, talking about translation. And in just a couple minutes in this room, we're going to have three amazing short story writers, three fiction writers who are going to talk about, we're going to read from their own work and tell us a bit about what they think is the state of the contemporary Caribbean short story. It's going to be a great event, even if they're not poets. So we're back on in 5 minutes. Thanks, everyone.